April 3, 2026. A U.S. Air Force F-15E Strike Eagle is conducting a combat mission over Iranian airspace. It is flying at approximately 7,000 feet, low-altitude, precision strike configuration. Then it's gone. Shot down by what U.S. President Donald Trump himself described as a handheld shoulder missile, a heat-seeking missile, fired from the ground by a single operator. The two pilots ejected. They were rescued. But the question that followed that shoot-down rippled through every intelligence agency in Washington. Where did Iran get a missile capable of hitting a multi-million-dollar U.S. combat aircraft at that altitude? In the middle of a war where the United States had spent weeks systematically dismantling Iran's air defense infrastructure. Iran called it a new system. They gave no further details. 3 days later, U.S. intelligence had an answer. And that answer did not come from Tehran. It came from Beijing. I'm Grant Williams. This is the Williams Perspective. And today, we are going inside the intelligence assessments, the leaked documents, the satellite data, and the diplomatic back channels that reveal how China has been quietly fighting a shadow war inside Iran's war with the United States, while publicly calling for peace. If you're watching this for the first time, hit subscribe right now. Because what I'm about to show you is the kind of layered, sourced breakdown that you are not going to find in a 2-minute news segment. To understand what China did during this war, you first need to understand what China built before it. On March 27, 2021, 5 years before the first U.S. airstrike hit Iranian soil, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi traveled to Tehran. What he signed that day was not a trade agreement. It was a 25-year comprehensive strategic cooperation agreement between the People's Republic of China and the Islamic Republic of Iran. The document committed China to investing $400 billion in Iranian energy and infrastructure over the life of the deal. Oil and trade transactions between the two countries would be settled in Chinese yuan, deliberately bypassing the U.S. dollar and the international banking system that U.S. sanctions depend on. But buried deeper in that agreement was the detail that concerned Western defense analysts most. Iran agreed to install China's Beidou navigation satellite system on its ballistic missiles. Beidou is China's answer to GPS. It has global coverage. It provides precision navigation data to within centimeters. And as of 2021, Iran was integrating it into the guidance systems of its missile arsenal. The same missiles that would, 5 years later, strike U.S. military bases across the Middle East. That agreement was the foundation. But the construction that followed it went much further than anyone publicly acknowledged at the time. Between 2021 and the outbreak of the war in February 2026, Chinese companies, some state-linked, some nominally private, supplied Iran with a systematic set of military-enabling technologies, dual-use electronics that could be adapted for missile production, radar systems, navigation components, semiconductor manufacturing tools. The U.S. would later accuse China's Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation of providing chip-making equipment to Iran's military directly. And throughout this entire period, multiple Iranian ships carrying sodium perchlorate, a key precursor material for solid propellant rockets, made the journey from Chinese ports to Iranian ones. Ships that appeared on U.S. Treasury watch lists, docking at Chinese ports anyway. By February 28, 2026, the day U.S. and Israeli aircraft launched Operation Epic Fury against Iran, China had spent 5 years quietly building the military-industrial foundation that Iran would use to fight back. What happened after that date was something different, something more direct, and something that Beijing has denied with remarkable consistency while the evidence of it accumulates in U.S. intelligence files, leaked Iranian documents, and official American sanctions announcements. Let's start with what is, by any measure, the most consequential piece of Chinese support to Iran during this conflict, and the one that received the least coverage relative to its significance. In late 2024, months before the war began, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Aerospace Force made a purchase. The item, a high-resolution commercial reconnaissance satellite called the TEE-01B, built by a Chinese company called Earth Eye Co., which, according to public records, advertises its connections to Chinese universities known to work with the People's Liberation Army. The price, approximately $36.6 million. Paid in Chinese yuan. Under the agreement, the IRGC was granted access to commercial ground stations operated by a Beijing-based company called Imposat, a provider of satellite control and data services. Imposat has been linked by a U.S. congressional report to China's People's Liberation Army Aerospace Force. The significance of this satellite cannot be overstated. Iran's own military satellites, the Noor series, captured images at roughly 5-meter resolution. Useful for general surveillance, not sufficient for precise military targeting. The TA-1B captured images at half-meter resolution, comparable to the best commercially available Western satellites. Sufficient to count aircraft on a runway, to identify the position of a Patriot missile battery, to monitor the movement of specific vehicles at a specific military installation. The Financial Times obtained leaked Iranian military documents showing exactly how the IRGC used this capability. Time-stamped coordinate lists, satellite imagery, orbital analysis. The satellite captured images of Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, a major U.S. Air Force installation, and on March 13th, 14th, and 15th of 2026. On March 14th, U.S. President Donald Trump confirmed that U.S. aircraft at that base had been struck. 5 U.S. Air Force refueling planes were damaged in the attack. The satellite also monitored Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, a facility used by U.S. Special Operations Forces. Locations near the U.S. 5th Fleet Naval Headquarters in Manama, Bahrain. Erbil Airport in Iraq, around the time of IRGC claimed attacks on nearby facilities. Camp Buehring in Kuwait. Ali Al Salem Air Base, also in Kuwait. Camp Lemonnier, the U.S. military's primary hub in Africa, in Djibouti. The Khor-Fakkan container port in the UAE. A power and desalination plant in Fujairah. An aluminium smelter in Bahrain. A former CIA analyst focused on Iran described the strategic logic of this arrangement plainly to the Irish Times. Iran's own satellite ground stations, he noted, are fixed targets. They can be hit by missiles from 1,000 miles away. A Chinese ground station located in a third country cannot be targeted the same way. This was not an accident of commercial relationships. This was a deliberate architecture designed to give Iran a surveillance capability that would survive the opening strikes of any conflict routed through Chinese infrastructure that the United States could not destroy without directly attacking a Chinese company on Chinese soil. The CIA declined to comment on the satellite arrangement when asked by the Financial Times. The White House did not specifically address the relationship between EMPASAT and the IRGC. China's embassy in Washington said the reports were disinformation. Now let's return to April 3rd, 2026. The day the F-15E went down, Trump described the weapon as a handheld shoulder missile. A heat-seeking missile? The weapon type he was describing, without naming it, is a MANPAD. Man-Portable Air Defense System, shoulder-fired. Operated by a single soldier, designed to destroy low-flying aircraft. MANPADs have been a concern for Western militaries for decades, not because any single one is particularly powerful, but because they are cheap, portable, easy to conceal, and extremely difficult to defend against at low altitude. They cannot be jammed the same way radar-guided systems can. They follow heat. Fighter jets and attack aircraft produce enormous amounts of heat. The U.S. has spent decades working to prevent MANPAD proliferation specifically because of what they do to air power. An enemy with MANPADs forces pilots to fly higher. Flying higher reduces accuracy, reduces the effectiveness of close air support, changes the entire geometry of an air campaign. By early April 2026, Iran had them. On April 11th, 8 days after the F-15E was shot down, CNN reported the following, citing 3 people familiar with recent intelligence assessments. U.S. intelligence indicated that China was preparing to deliver new air defense systems to Iran within the next few weeks. The systems: shoulder-fired anti-air missile systems, MANPADs. 2 of the sources told CNN there were already signs that Beijing was working to route the shipments through third countries to mask their true origin. Intelligence analysts working on the assessment noted a specific candidate weapon, the Chinese FN-6 NATO reporting name CHSA-10, one of China's most advanced export-oriented shoulder-fired missiles. Operating altitude, 15 meters to 3,500 meters. The F-15E that was shot down was flying at approximately 2,130 meters, directly within that envelope. The New York Times reported separately that U.S. intelligence had obtained evidence suggesting China may have already delivered at least 1 shipment of MANPADs to Iran before the CNN report was even published. CBS News added another layer. The U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency assessed that China was also considering supplying Iran with X-band radar systems, more sophisticated ground-based sensors capable of tracking stealth aircraft at longer ranges. And there was a 4th category of Chinese support that emerged from the same intelligence picture: Chinese companies had provided Iran with dual-use technology throughout the conflict, materials used in the production of drones and missiles, navigation components, the kind of supply chain support that keeps a military-industrial base functioning under sanctions pressure. Trump was informed of the CNN report the same day it was published. His response: China's going to have big problems if it goes through with weapons shipments to Iran. He then announced that any country supplying military weapons to Iran would face an immediate 50% tariff on exports to the United States, with no exceptions. Beijing's response came through its embassy in Washington. A spokesperson said, and I'm paraphrasing to avoid reproducing their exact words, China has never provided weapons to any party in the conflict. The reports are untrue. China consistently fulfills its international obligations. The denial was clean, categorical, and it arrived at the same time as the intelligence assessment, saying the opposite. In diplomacy and intelligence, what a government does matters far more than what it says. China said it was not arming Iran. The United States government, through its own sanctions apparatus, spent the following weeks systematically documenting what it assessed was actually happening. Let's go through the record. In March 2026, the United States accused China's Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, SMIC, one of China's largest chip makers, of providing chip-making tools to Iran's military. Is a company with deep ties to the Chinese state and to China's national technology ambitions. In April 2026, the U.S. Treasury Department sanctioned one of China's largest independent oil refineries, the Hengli petrochemical facility in Dalian, for processing Iranian crude oil. While Iranian oil is under comprehensive U.S. sanctions, Hengli was buying it anyway. On May 1st, 2026, 4 days before Trump was scheduled to fly to Beijing, China's National Financial Regulatory Administration ordered Chinese banks to stop extending new loans to 5 U.S.-sanctioned refineries. 2 days later, on May 2nd, China's Ministry of Commerce issued a countermanding order, telling Chinese companies and banks to disregard U.S. sanctions on Chinese refineries entirely. Beijing formally declared those sanctions a violation of international law and enacted a blocking statute, a legal instrument passed in 2021 but never previously used, prohibiting any Chinese entity from recognizing or complying with American sanctions. Then on May 8, 2026, 5 days before Trump landed in Beijing, the U.S. State Department announced sanctions against 3 Chinese commercial satellite companies. The Earth Eye, also known as Beijing Mumei Starry Sky Technology, the company that built the TE-0OMB satellite purchased by the IRGC, Mi-Entropy Technology, also known as Mizar Vision, Chongguang Satellite Technology, a company that had previously been sanctioned in December 2023 for supplying satellite imagery to Yemen's Houthi movement to help them target U.S. military assets. It was supplying imagery to Iran now. The State Department's statement was direct. These companies provided satellite imagery and geospatial intelligence that enabled Iranian military strike planning during Operation Epic Fury. The strikes that hit 5 U.S. refueling planes at Prince Sultan. The strikes that targeted the Fifth Fleet. The strikes across the Gulf region that killed and wounded U.S. personnel. The intelligence picture that emerges from these sanctions is not abstract. Named companies, named satellite systems, time-stamped imagery, documented strike sequences. China's response to the sanctions was to call them illegal unilateral pressure and formally instruct Chinese entities to ignore them. That is the documented record. Not claims. Official U.S. government actions based on classified and unclassified intelligence taken in the weeks leading up to a summit between the two countries' leaders. Let me bring this out of the intelligence briefing room and into a place where it directly connects to your life. The war with Iran has pushed Brent crude oil prices to over $100 a barrel. U.S. crude is near 98. Average gasoline prices across the United States are $4.52 a gallon, according to the latest TAA data. That is the direct cost at the pump of the Strait of Hormuz being contested, of roughly 230 loaded oil tankers sitting anchored in the Persian Gulf, waiting. Every additional week that China's support keeps Iran militarily functional enough to contest the strait is another week of elevated oil prices. Another week of fuel costs, transportation costs, grocery prices, all running higher than they would in a resolved conflict. But there is a longer-term dimension to this that matters more. The CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, published a report this week assessing U.S. military readiness for a potential conflict with China. Their conclusion, the United States would struggle. During the Iran War, the US fired over a quarter of its total THAAD interceptors in a matter of days. It potentially depleted over 50% of its pre-war inventory of THAAD, SM-3, and Patriot interceptors across the conflict. Production timelines for replacing those systems run 3 to 4 years. Because here is the thing about strategic ambiguity. It only works as long as both sides are willing to accept the ambiguity. At some point, the intelligence record becomes too clear to ignore. At some point, a downed American aircraft, a struck American base, a documented satellite transfer, a MANPAD shipment, these things add up to something that requires a response beyond a tariff threat and a letter. Where that point is, and whether the Trump administration has reached it, is the question that will define not just how this war ends, but how the next one begins. Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. This has been the Williams Perspective. I'm Grant Williams.